We're already in here, everybody. It's gonna be the last one. It's gonna be the last one here, not the first one.
Oh, they're streaming in.
I'm just coming here to hide.
Aha. How was Jane on Tuesday? On Sunday?
What?
How was Jane? You said you
I'm seeing her today.
You see today, okay.
Best. Now we'll hope that the phone
If it's
works.
snarky, let me know and I'll move over.
I think we took the rest of it.
It was more than that.
Oh.
I thought we did it, Anthony.
Oh, okay.
I was gonna, see, I think you took
I
it.
just wanted to tell you.
Yeah, no, I brought some over yesterday afternoon, put them in. And also got some candles.
It seems to be working so far. All right, we're going to get going. We had some technical difficulties at the early service. For some reason, my phone wasn't talking to the computer, and advancing the slides. So I may have to jump over there and advance the slides, but that's okay. You can listen to me from anywhere. Look up there. So today, we're going to talk about all of the other stuff that that rarely gets talked about what happened at Nicaea. We're so focused on the theological debates and the Nicene Creed that most of us don't even know that there was other stuff that went on. And if there was, most of us haven't a clue about what it was that went on. And I will raise my hand and say, even though I have a doctorate in early Christian history, when I went back and looked at what all of the things that they talked about, all of the things that they clearly voted on, I was surprised. I knew one of them very well, and we'll get to that, but I didn't know all of the other stuff. So what I want to do is I want to start by talking about what lay behind the scenes of the council. Certainly there were all of the theological debates that were going on, but there was other stuff that was going on. And I'm indebted here not so much to about what the other stuff that was going on was, because I know all of that, but to the formation of this is from this book by Maurice Wiles, The Christian Fathers. And he set out these four categories of things that the church had to figure out. Okay, Jesus had died 300 years before, roughly, 300 years before the council. So the church had been in existence for 300 years. How was it organized? What were the problems that it faced? You know, all of that kind of stuff, we just sort of forget. Many of us want to just sort of go back and say, well, is it in the New Testament? No, okay, that's fine. And we move forward. And we don't realize how these things kind of came to be. And so one of the questions that the church had to decide was, is it mixed? Is the church body a mixed body or a pure body? We'll get into that a little bit more. How was ministry structured? Who were the ministers? All of that kind of thing. What was the tension between a local expression of the church and the church universal? And then lastly, how is the church unified or held together? So those discussions all lay behind the things that we'll talk about in a minute. So is the church mixed or pure? I mean, if the baptized are imperfect, how is the body of Christ constituted? If it's only pure people, then that means that there's nobody there, right? So, so how do you, what happens? I know none of the, present company accepted, but what happens after baptism to those who sin? So are you thrown out of the church once you sin? Or what happens? These were debates that were going on. And of course, the big sin during these first 300 years, because there were lots of persecutions, was apostasy. What happens if somebody renounces the faith? Because they don't want to get their hand cut off, or their eyes put out, or, to be banished, or any of those kinds of things. So they, whatever, and then they say after the persecutions have ended, I want back in. Oops, mulligan. So how do we get back in? Well, in 250, there was a persecution under the Emperor Decius. This was a really big one. There were a couple of really big persecutions. So 75 years before the council, there was this big persecution, and a lot of people said, I don't want to lose my life. And so they left. So persecution ended, and then they came back in. They wanted back in. What was their status with the church? Is the church pure or is the church mixed? Were they supposed to spend the rest of their life in penitence? Or could they ever be readmitted to communion? These are debates. This really isn't answered in the New Testament. We're pretty lax about all of that, right? But this was a big deal in the first 300 or 400 years. Well, there was a bishop of Rome. His name was Novatius. And basically he said, no readmittance. Once you decide you're out, you're out. So here's the Bishop of Rome. Got a lot of followers saying you're out. The rest of the church, not so much. They all believed the same thing. They all were baptized with the same understandings. Their theology was all the same. This was just a question of who can come back in. So they separated themselves from the rest of the Christian body. So this is a question not of heresy, but a question of schism. Okay? Now this one bedevils us forever. Anglicans are much more worried about schism than we are about heresy. So it starts back here. A few decades later, there was another persecution, Diocletian, and similar issue about purity. And what arose out of the Diocletian persecution was a question about clergy orders. If a clergy person fled or sort of apostatized, were the clergy person's orders still valid? Could he still celebrate communion or baptize or those kinds of things? So again, this is a question not so much of heresy, but of schism. And so is the church made up of only the pure, or is it mixed? So that's the first question that was being debated.
Gary?
Yeah.
What did those words mean, and maybe I should know? Decian and Dom.
Okay, so Decian is just the persecution under the Emperor Decius.
Oh.
And Diocletian is under the persecution under the Emperor Diocletian.
Okay.
So that's why.
They're property.
Yeah, and my phone is doing the same thing that it was doing before. So I may have to move over there. Okay, all right. I don't know what's going on. This is very strange. Never had this happen before.
My phone's nuts.
Okay, I'm going to turn my phone off so it doesn't. So yeah. So the church, ministry matters. So the church is basically a school for sinners, right?
Should be.
Yep. So a school for sinners needs schoolmasters, right? To teach the sinners how to amend their ways. And so, but the schoolmasters, like any teacher, have to be properly accredited and, from the appropriate authorities. You have to be licensed in the state of Colorado to teach, and you have to prove that you're capable of teaching. So how do we do that? So that was an issue that the church was dealing with. Ignatius of Antioch, early 2nd century, so about 100 years after Jesus died, was worried about these, these Gnostic disruptors. These were people who were basically heretics, and they were going to come into the church. So how do the leaders of the church ensure that the church stays one when you've got people from the outside coming in? This isn't so much a theological debate, although it turned into that, but it's a structural debate. Who can teach, who can't? And so unity was to be found in loyalty to the leadership of the congregation. And at this early point, the leader of the congregation was basically a bishop. Every church had a bishop/priest. And then they began to develop, the hierarchy began to develop a little bit more. So unity was found in loyalty to the leadership. Later in that century, Irenaeus, Gnosticism was still a problem. But how do you know that the bishops are being unified in their thinking, are orthodox? Succession of bishops. Bishops create new bishops. Oh, where have we heard that before? Okay, so this is where this is coming from and why. It's to assure the tradition of the faith is carried on. And if you've got 3 or 4 or 5 bishops who are going to ordain another bishop, they've got to be unified as to whether or not this new bishop is going to be ordained. So you can guarantee unity. And so, the argument was that rebelling against the bishop is rebelling against Christ, that they are standing in for Christ. And then, and Cyprian just sort of argued similarly that the succession of the church's life was dependent on the succession of bishops. All right. So all of these things are roiling around before Nicaea. Well, is it local or is it universal? Is the church embodied in this congregation, or is it bigger? Is there a diocese, or is there something bigger than that? And the argument that Tertullian, who was eventually declared a heretic, but he wasn't always heretical, said the apostles wouldn't have differed from one another, so the church shouldn't either. You can take that argument?
Say that again, please.
The apostles, they would not have differed from one another. They may have argued.
They did in their writings.
They may have argued about who was the greatest, but Jesus kind of put that one to the. But this was Tertullian's argument. So since they wouldn't have differed, the churches shouldn't. Okay, this is unity, or larger than just what's local. So what happens when 2 churches disagree? And one of the early disagreements was over the date of Easter.
Oh, that's why there's 2 days.
And so you've got 2 churches that disagree over Easter. So that gets addressed, we'll get there, that gets addressed at Nicaea. But here's a disagreement. And then where is Rome in all of this?
Is there a pope?
There was a bishop of Rome, and he was, the early church declared all of the major patriarchates, so that's Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome. Constantinople hadn't made it yet, but those 4, they all had a patriarch, the big daddy. Well, in Latin, that was Pope, that was Papa, so that was what was going on. So did Rome have a position of honor? Well, yeah, Peter and Paul were there. That's pretty honorable. But did that mean it had authority?
Not yet.
Not yet is exactly right, And so going back to Cyprian and Stephen of Rome, they both said, we got to have councils. There isn't a single authority. Each bishop should be over his region. So Rome, the Bishop of Rome, is over Italy and all of what's considered the area of Rome. Similarly, Alexandria is over Egypt and Libya and all of that kind of stuff. Antioch over these other places. But no one of them was over the whole church. And if you go to the Orthodox, they will still say that's true. Rome may be first among equals. Some might say that, but is not over everybody else. And it's like our presiding bishop is first among equals, theoretically, doesn't have authority, except the authority of the gavel, but doesn't have theology. So, next one. And then where is unity found? Since Christ could only have one body or one bride, there has to be one people of God. That's the argument. Cyprian would argue that the church is one ark of salvation. And a famous line from him is, ex ecclesiam es nullis solus. Outside the church, there is no salvation. So you have to be within the church to be saved. And that argues both against schism and against heresy. All right? So, you know, if you're schismatic and you're theologically correct, and the only thing that you're disagreeing about is issues of purity or morals, you know, so this goes back to pure or mixed, right? But where is unity found? Whose baptisms are valid? If you don't, even if you use the right formula in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, but you don't have the same theological understanding of who that is, then your baptism is not valid. On the other hand, if you have the same understanding of who all of those people are, and you just say, no, you're not pure enough, then you're schismatic and you're outside the church. Okay, so this is what the church was arguing about, all of these things. And then that last question, what's worse, schism or heresy? Wrong belief or wrong association? If you cut yourself out, you know. And that, like I say, that one goes on. We have a lot of Christian siblings who clearly believe that heresy is much more important than schism, and Anglicans traditionally have believed schism is much more important than heresy. If you believe the old saying that Elizabeth held up a prayer book and said, I don't care what you believe, use this book. Yeah. That's all about schism and heresy. No schism, I don't care what you think. You know, so that's been, like I say, been a besetting, a common critique of the Episcopal Church, is we'll kind of go anywhere because we don't, you know, well, we want to keep the church together. We want to build a big tent and get as many people in as possible. So the questions of heresy are less important than the questions of people who aren't under the umbrella and keeping dry. So now these were the things that were going on, and we'll touch on all of them as we go forward. Any comments before we move forward on this?
Sounds like the United States of America right now.
There is, yeah. Civil religion in its own way.
Who gets to have communion, who doesn't get to have communion? Have you been baptized appropriately, or have you not been baptized appropriately?
Yep.
And I taught this is ironic, I worked at an American Baptist summer camp my junior year, between my junior and senior year in high school. And I was the only Presbyterian, of course. And I was constantly told, you need to be baptized again because we don't believe in infant. And I wrote my dad, who was a wonderful father, every week, and he said, you tell him that John the Baptist said, I baptize you with water, but he who follows me baptizes you with the fire. And I did, and they shut up. But I mean, those are, people have those beliefs, and, you know, God bless you, but I don't.
Other comments, questions? Okay, next slide. So the canons, there were 20 canons that were decided on at this council. And I've grouped them into different categories that sort of overlap or are informed by the four that I just gave you. But they really sort of group into four groupings, or 4 or 5 groupings in and of themselves. And so the first grouping is those who've erred. So here, you know, what happens when you've been excommunicated and you want to come back in? As for the clergy and laity in various provinces who've been excommunicated, the bishops should observe the provision of the canon which states that someone excommunicated by one bishop is not to be readmitted by another. I'm just going to go down the street, they'll take me.
I said no, I'll ask them.
Yeah. So, you know, this is a question of leadership and of unity, right? Nevertheless, he should investigate to see if the excommunication has come about from excessive stringency. The pure people over here, you know, oh, my goodness, you gambled, you're out. Contentiousness, you're going to argue with me, you're out. Or any other ungracious attitude on the part of the excommunicating bishop. So that these matters may be duly investigated, we decree that in every province, councils shall be held twice a year, so that when all the bishops of the province are assembled together, all such questions may be thoroughly examined by them. In this way, everyone can see how those who have confessedly offended their bishop have been justly excommunicated, unless it shall seem fit to the general meeting of the bishops to pronounce a milder sentence upon them. The first of these councils should be held before Lent, that the pure gift may be offered to God after all bitterness has been put away, and the second in the autumn. So if you recall, or if you think ahead to what you will hear on Ash Wednesday, when those who by reason of grievous sins have been separated, this provided a chance for them to be reunited. This is why it's before Lent. This practice goes back 1700 years. Okay? So to allow folks back in the fold. All right, so you're learning about becoming a Christian and you lapse. You haven't made it all the way through. You just lapse. The Holy and Great Council, that being Nicaea, has decreed that after they have passed just 3 years as hearers, they shall again pray with catechumens. So this gets into the process as how you converted and became a Christian. You spent a particular amount of time in the category known as hearers when you were listening to scripture and all that, and then you got thrown out of the church. Thrown out of the building. Then you would join the catechumens, where you would really be inaugurated more into what all of the mysteries were and how to understand what was going on. And then after that period, you were really a full member. All right, so this was like a 10-year process. It's not 5 weeks of Episcopal 101.
Children, I grew up in Sunday school. God, I was probably there when I was 2 weeks old. But that's the hearers.
Yep.
And then catechism happened when you were 12 or 13.
Yep.
And so that's not foreign to me at all.
Right. So here, they'll say you have to just 3 years in this one category, and then you go in with this other group, and then you're admitted. So if you go to an Orthodox service now, you'll hear echoes of this, because there's a point at which, I think it's after the reading of the gospel, or maybe the seminary, a deacon will say, the doors, and certain doors inside the church are closed, because that meant that was when the people who had not been fully admitted into the congregation were to leave. And we used to have an office, not in the Episcopal Church so much, the Roman Catholic Church did, of the people who stood at the doors. This was one of the various offices in the church, like deacon or something else. There were the doorkeeper, there were the acolytes, and there were the lectors, and there were the exorcists, and the deacons, or the subdeacons, the deacons, and the priests, and the bishop. The very first one was the doorkeeper. Can you be let in? So outside the church, there is no salvation, so you want to get in. So the doors is one of those things that you will hear in a traditional Orthodox liturgy. And this is, I've never been thrown out. It's probably the odor of sanctity. All right, next slide. All right. Readmitted for those who've returned to the military. So this is fascinating, because there are a number of different arguments about what this one actually means. But is this a statement of pacifism? You're not supposed to become a soldier. Or is this an issue about who you are swearing allegiance to? And can you swear allegiance to the emperor, or is Christ Lord? So if you make the statement of allegiance that Christ is Lord, and you leave the military, what happens if you want to go back into the military, let's say after 313 and Christianity has been legalized? So the argument is, as for those who were called by grace and at first zealously threw away their military uniforms, but then, I love this, then later returned like dogs to their own vomit, so that some regained their military positions through bribes and gifts, let these spend 3 years as hearers and 10 years as prostrators, penitents. But in all such cases, it's necessary to carefully examine why, and if they are repentant, If they do tears and perseverance and good works, so there are these processes for letting somebody back in who had moved out, who had erred, and who had moved out of the true faith.
It sounds like you're in a second to me. I'll respect it.
So, how about just those who'd fallen? So, as for those who transgressed without being compelled, in other words, there was nobody standing over you with an axe, without danger or the like, as happened during the tyranny of Licinius, the council declares that they should be dealt with mercifully, though they in no way deserve it. It's just such a hoot to read these things, right? If they truly repent, they shall spend 3 years among the hearers, 7 years as prostrators, and then for 2 years they may join with the congregation in prayers, but cannot receive the Eucharist. So there's these various areas that these stages that you go through for admission to the Eucharist. And we're arguing about whether or not you have to be baptized, or if you can just, if your heart is being strangely warmed. I mean, we're not nowhere near this. This one's what, 15 years? 15 years. Pardon?
You really had to want it.
Yeah, you had to. So this is, they're trying to figure out how to be pastoral and be faithful to the theology and what we swear, the doctrine and practices of the Episcopal Church. I have to swear that I'm going to be faithful to that. The ordained have to, so that's what they're doing. Readmission of the Cathari. These are the people who followed Bishop Novatius, who believed that you had to be absolutely pure. So these are schismatics, okay? Their theology was right, they were just schismatics. They didn't want to be in alignment with the Church of Rome. They thought the Church of Rome was too liberal. The Church of Rome was too liberal. Yeah, they just allow in sinners, for crying out loud, and so that's what this whole one is all about. And I'm not going to go any further than that, just to say that it's a process, and this is a question of how do you in some respects, and I'm not quite sure how this happens in the Episcopal Church, but I've read in the last year of 2 Anglican Church of North America. So these are schismatic Anglican churches who left the Episcopal Church nationwide. 2 of these congregations have wanted to reassociate with the Episcopal Church. I don't know what the process for that is, but it's the same thing. It's readmitting schismatics. So maybe we should say, wait a minute, are you following this canon from? Send us up the street to the 815 and say, it says this. All right, next one.
Do we have a process?
I don't know. There must be. I just don't know what it is. Yeah, they left, so how do we readmit them? I don't know what that process is.
We have communion with several denominations, groups that.
Yeah, we have communion with groups that we've historically been separated from, but they didn't separate from us, like the Anglican Church of North America, those congregations. So the Methodists and the Episcopalians or the Presbyterians, we all grew, but it wasn't like the Methodists said, we don't like you anymore, we're going to be over here. It was just, we're going to be over here. Certainly that wasn't the case with Presbyterians. So, so we were never schismatic. We just had to figure out how to get back together. This is a different thing. So Paul of Samosata was a teacher, whatever, something. He just believed that Jesus didn't pre-exist. So here's a theological difference. He believed that the Logos came upon Jesus at Jesus' birth, and it was only through righteousness that Jesus achieved oneness with God. So he was indwelled by the Spirit, by the Logos, by the Word of God, but it was his own purity that through which he achieved oneness with God. So he was accused of heresy and removed. He was a bishop, removed from that office. Now, what this says is that his followers have to be rebaptized because they did not have the right baptismal understanding, because they didn't believe the right things about Jesus. Okay? It was not to be accepted. If they were clergy, they had to be rebaptized and then they could be ordained. But their orders did not go across. Now, I've been on the board of examining chaplains in this diocese. Mary was on it. And we've had instances where somebody has come from another tradition and wanted to become an Episcopal priest. Some of these people have come from another tradition, already ordained in that tradition. And it's problematic because they don't want to be told by the bishop that we do not recognize your orders. You need to go through our process to become ordained, even though you were ordained somewhere else. So that's not quite like this because it's not heretical, but it's just somebody coming in from outside. Okay, next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk about ordination, and this is my favorite canon of all. Castration among the clergy. Yes, Deacon Nadine.
Sorry, this is kind of to go back to what you were just saying, but, so how was it then, or could you explain the difference between that and, maybe I already know the answer, but anyway, Bishop Chris, or excuse me, Father Chris at Peter and Mary that shares, so they're Roman Catholic, or they're Catholic.
They're Catholic, yeah.
But they were just, he was just received into the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, I'm unclear about how all of that practice came about. I do not, all I know is that the Episcopal Church is in full communion with old Catholics who, have apostolic succession but do not bow down, pardon the pun, bow down to Rome. But I'm not sure where we stand with this group that's called Ecumenical Catholics. And I'm not sure exactly where they come from in their tradition. So I don't know the answer to that.
They would call themselves old Catholics.
The
The Ecumenical Catholic Church calls themselves old Catholics.
who does?
The Ecumenical.
No, but this is an interesting congregation that we've received into the Episcopal Diocese of Colorado.
Oh, okay.
And they're, I don't know how much you know about that congregation,
Not
but
anything.
they're very Orthodox, it seems.
Yeah.
They do,
Yeah, St. Mary equal to the apostles.
yeah.
Yeah. The Samaritan woman, given the name Fotini, is also considered equal among the apostles. So in the Orthodox tradition. So I don't know. I need to look into it. So why is this my favorite one? I'm just going to read it to you. If anyone, due to sickness, has undergone a surgical operation, or if he has been castrated by barbarians, he is allowed to remain among the clergy. But if anyone enrolled among the clergy has castrated himself when in perfect health, it is good for him to leave the ministry. From now on, no such person should be promoted to the clergy. But since this applies only to those who willfully castrate themselves, if anyone has been made a eunuch by barbarians or by his master who was a slave, and is otherwise fit for office, church law admits him to the clergy. This was the topic of my doctoral dissertation. I am the world's expert on this. So there you go. No, because of course you remember Matthew 19:12, right? Yeah. At the end of the debate about divorce, there are those who were castrated by others, those who were made eunuchs by others, those who were born a eunuch, those who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. We read that in almost every commentary. 99.5% of the commentaries will say, this is an argument for clerical celibacy. And my dissertation said, no, it was never a metaphor. Eunuch, that word, was never a metaphor until Christians got a hold of it. And we had to reinterpret it. Part of the reason was for this reason, self-castration, but there were a lot of other reasons. And so I find it fascinating that at this council, the first item of business had to do with the topic that I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. So, but you know, it certainly clerical celibacy was becoming a thing. We'll see this a little more as we go on. But there were a number of reasons why people were doing this. And the church had to reinterpret Matthew 19:12 to take those reasons away. And it had its reasons for doing so, and that was the topic of my dissertation. Now, we do a whole class on that, I guess.
Just one question, you know, there were, and this would be medieval, probably not this time, but, boys' choirs.
Yep.
And sometimes a fine voice would be, where you might not, the child might not have full control over what.
So, yeah.
So it's.
How does that fit in? Yeah. So it was against canon law to do this. Became so later in Roman Catholicism. And but you know, if there was a slaver who did this to some slave, child or whatever, that was sort of outside, you know, sort of outside the law, and you could not punish the individual. So, yeah, that was the, you know, is it within the realm of the empire, for example? Where does the empire begin and end? You know, so it's against the law in Colorado to do it, but oh, those people in New Mexico, wow, you know how they are. You know, and so we're not going to punish the New Mexican kids for what happened in New Mexico. So when they come to Colorado, we're going to deal with them differently. Now, some of you or many of you may have heard the phrase Dar es Salaam. This is a Arabic phrase that means within the community of Islam. You would think about all of these eunuchs that are over the harems and all of that kind of stuff. Technically, within Dar es Salaam, you can't do this either. But outside that, oh, those barbarians in the you know, they're over there in Bulgaria. They're all, you know, they don't care about it. But you know, so we'll take those boys and we'll give them a job. Okay, so it's how are you defining who's in and who's out, and what's appropriate for who's in and who's out.
Thing is, it's pretty clear the church did.
Yeah. But it took a while. This canon wasn't the first to reference this, and it wasn't the last. But this was sort of the biggest. Okay, next slide. I'm gonna run out of time here. I'm having too much fun. The ordination of the recently converted. All right. Oh, I'm filled with passion. I want to be a priest. So this is just to slow down, make sure that they've spent the appropriate amount of time, that they know what's going on. We can't do it just because we have too few clergy. That's what it says. Whether this has been done because of a lack of ministers or simply from impatience, it is contrary to church law. We've seen, Mary will agree, we've seen people who did not want to wait for the process to run its course. I feel called now, you know. I had a student when I was teaching at Duke. He was a Methodist, and he was not the brightest bulb in the pack, we'll just say. And he said, why do I need to learn church history? I want to just go out and serve Jesus. Well, we got to run through the process and make sure, you know, this is the proper, sort of the proper preparation. So, you know, we've got canons in our book of Constitution canons that talk about length of time that it takes to go through the ordination process. And in one of the conversations that we often have in the Board of Examining Chaplains is with people who've not been Episcopalians for very long. They may have been very devout in another tradition, but, you know, do you know how to say morning prayer? No. Well, maybe you should spend some time learning how to lead stuff out of the prayer book. You know, so to get people, you know, that, next one. Priests who were improperly examined before ordination. Are you academically prepared? That's what the BOEC is doing. And we've got canons in our Constitution canons that says you've got to be proficient in 6 areas. And you've got to have the right kinds of grades. You have to have an MDiv. You have to do, you know. So what happens if these people had not been prepared well enough? We're not supposed to let this happen. We just it's wrong. We're not going to allow for this to happen. We want, I like it, the Catholic Church requires that which is blameless. You know, not quite so much, but
Process, as a person.
yeah. Removal of clergy who are discovered to have fallen, if some have lapsed, but then have been ordained through the ignorance of the bishops who ordained them, or even with the previous knowledge, it must not influence the decision of the church. When such men are discovered, they must be deposed. So somebody lapsed, moved across the empire, rejoined, went through the process, and it was discovered that, wait a minute, they'd lapsed over in Libya. Out. Okay. Next one. Ordination requirements. It's most proper for a bishop to be appointed by all the bishops in his particular province. Okay? So this gets the unity, the succession, all of that sort of stuff together. If this proves impossible, either because there's not enough time or there's too much distance to be traveled, at least 3 should meet together, and the approval of the absent bishops should be given and communicated in writing. Only then should the ordination to take place. But in every province, the ratification of the ordination should be left to the metropolitan bishop, the one that is over that particular district. We need in the Episcopal Church 3 bishops for an ordination of a bishop to be valid. For the ordination of a bishop to be valid, a majority of all of the other dioceses and the diocesan bishops have to send in their permission. And usually a bishop is ordained by the presiding bishop if he or she can be there. This is what goes on with us right now. Again, 1,700 years old. I doubt that 99% of our clergy or bishops know that, but that's okay. That's okay. They can take my class. Next one. Conduct of deacons. It has come to the knowledge of the Holy and Great Council that in some districts and cities, deacons are administering the Eucharist to the priests. Even though neither church law nor custom permits that those who have no right to offer it should give the body of Christ to those who can offer it, it has also become known to us that certain deacons now handle the Eucharist even before the bishops. Let all such practices be abolished, and let the deacons remain within their own bounds, knowing that they are the servants of the bishop and at a lower rank of the priests. Let them receive... Some things have changed. But this was a question of order and succession and all of those kinds of things. Clearly, by this point, there were major concerns about ordination and all of that. Next one. Because of the great disturbances and disagreements that have occurred of late, we decree that the custom which prevails in certain places must be totally done away with. Neither bishop, priest, nor deacon shall move from city to city. And if anyone, after this decree of the Holy and Great Council, shall attempt such a thing, or continue in any such course of action, his action shall be utterly void, and he must return to the church where he was ordained bishop or priest. I don't like my bishop, I'm going to go over there. No, can't do that. And how that boils down now is when I moved from California to Colorado, I had to ask for what are called letters de missouri, which means that my bishop in California sends a letter. Bill Swing sent a letter, Rob O'Neill, saying Gary was a priest in good standing in this diocese. We request that he be admitted with all of the rights and privileges of priest in your diocese. And Rob says, fine, sends it back. So I have come here under this sort of category of transient clergy, but it was with the full knowledge and permission of everyone else. Some of you may know priest that we have here. He's been out because of illness for quite a while, but Jim Minor, he's from the Diocese of Ohio. He has not asked to have his letters transferred here. He wants to remain, even though he lives here, he wants to remain in the Bishop of Ohio. That's where he lived and served. He's here because of grandchildren and things like that. But he does, so he's never going to serve at the altar because he does not want to do that, but he will teach classes. So he's not going to function liturgically. So he's not going through this process. But if we have somebody, in fact, when I mentioned this to either Diane Draper, who works, at the bishop's office, or to the bishop, I said, well, we've got this priest, and he's like, okay, well, you know that if he wants to do this, he has, I said, yes, I know.
Can he be licensed to preach?
He could be, I think he could be licensed to officiate, but he doesn't want that. So when I was living in North Carolina, I was living in Charlotte, which is close to the border between the Diocese of North Carolina, the Diocese of South Carolina, and the Diocese of Western North Carolina, just across the river from the Diocese of Western North Carolina. I would occasionally be asked to go and do supply in the Diocese of Western North Carolina. So I asked the bishop of the Diocese of Western North Carolina for a license to officiate, even though I was still canonically working in the Diocese of North Carolina.
And so do you also have to wait a year before you're canonically resident?
That I don't know. When I came here, I don't think I had to wait at all. As soon as the letters came across, I was in.
So why we have to wait?
Now that's a,
Bishop Chris did ask to be transferred. I mean,
pardon?
Bishop Chris. In this church.
Oh, I don't know whether the licenses to officiate work in the same way with bishops. I don't know. But whatever he needed, he's gotten. All right, let's see. Okay, and then there's the next slide is what happens when you do get transient clergy. Go back home. If they won't return, this is a different context, they must be excommunicated. So this is somebody who's not doing what we've been talking about, wanting to move because they're relocating. It really has to do with questions of which bishop you want to be with, not these other kinds of things. Next one. Women living with clergy. This isn't quite as good as Canon 1, but it's Canon 3. The Great Council has stringently forbidden any bishop, priest, deacon, or any of the clergy to have a sub-introducta living with him, except the mother, sister, aunt, or some such person who is beyond all suspicion. So a sub-introducta, love it, no? Actually, in the version, in the original version of these canons that I excerpted, these are the texts that I took out. This line was in many of the others, but was not in this one. I wanted to throw this in there because I think it's important. So sub-introducta were people, not just women, but people who took a vow of chastity. And so these were kind of pre-nuns before there were these order of nuns. And they might be living with one of these people, maybe acting as a housekeeper, maybe learning and studying with this other person. So it wasn't just, something that looked odd. But clearly it looked odd. And there may have been abuses of the practice. So to get rid of this is what was instituted. And you can watch, there are lots of, Father Brown mysteries. Any of you watch Father Brown? Okay, did any of you ever read the books or see the Canadian thing about Bless Me, Father? Oh, the housekeeper's name is Mrs. Pring. Anyway, they're just one, but the housekeeper doesn't live there.
Yeah, she does.
She comes in. Okay, so that's sort of a hangover from this canon. Yeah, Mary.
There was a Catholic school in Liberia up the hill from me, and there was an African man who was the priest, and there were 4 or 5 nuns from Ireland who were in the dormitories, and there was no one in town who could believe that the priest was celibate. He just thought they could only think of those women as his harem. Just did.
It was their culture. That's their culture.
Yep. Next slide.
Yeah.
Who would have thought? Many clergymen, being covetous and desirous for gain, have forgotten the divine scripture which says he does not lend at usury. And when in lending money, ask for 1% of the total as monthly interest. Sounds pretty good. The Holy and Great Council thinks it just that if after this decree anyone is found to receive usury, secretly or otherwise, such as by demanding the whole and one half, woohoo, or by using any other contrivance at all for filthy profit's sake, he shall be deposed. Now, this isn't usury in general. This is just clergy doing it, okay? So clearly, you don't pass a law unless somebody's doing it. So there were usurious clergy, because they could misuse their position. Next one. Okay, episcopal jurisdictions, and we'll run through these really quickly. Go ahead. All right, so the date of Easter. This had to do with jurisdictions, and it goes back to what happens when one church disagrees with another one. And so, when is Easter? Is it the Sunday closest to Passover? If so, which Sunday? Previous or the following? Is it just closest? Is it on 14 Nisan, which is Passover in the Jewish calendar? Some people argued one thing, some people argued the other. So regularize it. Let's not do it on Passover and make sure that it happens on a Sunday. So, the Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox, which is why it moves all over the place. And so the Western Church, Rome, and the Western Church basically said yes. The Eastern Church, which was on a different calendar, said no. And every so often they coincide, as they will this year, April 20th.
Holy cow.
So that was also decided. It wasn't a canon, but this was decided at the council in some of their other things. But this had to do with jurisdictions, because Rome was saying one thing and other churches were saying something else. So this came out of that. Alexandria, Rome, etc. All of these, I mentioned this early on, all of these major metropolitan areas have jurisdiction over everybody else in that area. So Denver, in the Episcopal Church of Colorado, that's where the diocesan office is, has jurisdiction over everything else that's in the state of Colorado. Diocese of Rio Grande crosses some state boundaries. So that jurisdiction isn't defined by geographical stuff or state boundaries, but I forget where Mary, do you know where the headquarters is for Rio Grande? El Paso? I don't know. Anyway, so all of the places that are part of that diocese are there. There's another diocese in the south.
The Gulf Coast.
Gulf Coast, Diocese of the Gulf Coast, that's larger than one state, or that includes more
Includes 3 states.
more than one state.
Part of the Panhandle out there.
So anyway,
There are places where, there are 5 dioceses, I think, in New York.
yeah.
State of New York.
Yeah, so there, in those situations, the Diocese of Colorado has our canons and constitution. The Diocese of Utah has its canons and constitution. Each bishop has control over his or her diocese. So Bishop Kim can make decisions that the Bishop of Utah may not like having effect in this diocese, in terms of, let's say, ordination schedules or things like that. It can't go against the national church canons, but in terms of the local church decides on a diocese by diocese level. Jerusalem, by virtue of honor, it's not a major metropolitan area, not like Alexandria or Antioch or Rome, but by purposes of honor is given the same dignity as these other 3 dioceses. And then, of course, later on, Constantinople got added to that as the new Rome. And then, many centuries later than that, Moscow assumed yet another one with the great addition of the Orthodox churches up there. All right, almost done. Good, running out of time. Miscellaneous. Next one. Communion for the dying. For those who are dying, the ancient church law is still to be maintained that if any man is at the point of death, he must not be deprived of the most indispensable final Eucharist. And this is really related to people who might have fallen away and are in the process to get back to communion. that they shouldn't be denied that last one. But if all of a sudden, whoa, I'm back, I got that last communion, I'm back, let him remain among those who commune in prayers only. They've gotten their last communion. But in general, and in the case of any dying person, let the bishop, after making examination, give the Eucharist to whoever asks to receive it. So it shouldn't be denied. This pastoral concern even at the end, regardless of schism or heresy. And then the last one, again, that hardly anybody pays any attention to. There are certain persons who kneel for prayer on the Lord's Day during Easter and in the days of Pentecost. But so that all things may be uniformly observed everywhere, it seems good to the Holy Council that prayers should be made to God while standing during those times. So, after you've spent Lent on your knees, you get all Easter to stand, all right? And because the Great and Holy Council of Nicaea in 325 said so. So there you go. You know more now than probably 99.9% of Episcopalians know about what was going on in Nicaea. I just love that stuff. I just think that it's so fascinating. And also to see how much of it has come into how we deal with stuff. And the reasons for that. You know, what was the reason for 3 bishops to ordain another bishop? You know, what were the reasons for some of these other things? Well, there were reasons, and they were real reasons, had historical antecedents, and then really got spelled out in these canons. This being the first time that the universal church was together making decisions that would spread across that universal church, which at that time was basically the Mediterranean. So, and there were bishops from Britain at this council, you know, bishops from North Africa, bishops from all over the Mediterranean. The Bishop of Rome was not there. He sent a legate, but he himself was not there. So a lot of this was Eastern. Probably 80% of the bishops were from the Eastern churches, but then you had some from Gaul and some from Britain and a few from Italy, but not many. There were, forget how many bishops there were. There were like 300 there, so there were a lot of folks. All right? Yep, you're welcome. Thank you.
I became acutely aware of the specific bishop's position to control their own diocese. The same as Mary. I was in Alabama.
Oh, yeah.